The book of Numbers has one of the most boring titles in all of the Bible. I mean, just in the Torah alone, you got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and then Numbers? But the title probably comes from the census and the head counts that appear in this book, as well as the massive amount of death. So in the wilderness on the great journey to the promised land, God asks Moses to count up the people, but specifically make note of those who are able to go to war. After all, there are people already in that promised land, so warfare is going to be inevitable. But if God's just going to automatically make the Canaanites lose, then is there really a point to count up how many troops Israel has? I mean, even if they just had one able-bodied person ready to fight, God still has the power to just swallow up whatever army opposes that person. So really, what exactly is the objective here? Perhaps it's for historical reasons, so it could be recorded here in the book, and it's less about calculating manpower and being tactical and all that. What follows after this is more Leviticus style writing, rules and customs that should govern the people of Israel at this time, how to set up the tents, how to assemble the people, all that. But right after that, we get back to the narrative, and guess what happens? You'll never guess what happens. The people of Israel start complaining. You better get used to this scene, folks, because it's going to happen a whole lot. Throughout the book, they'll complain about this or that, and sometimes it's relatively valid complaints, like needing water, In the first instance here, starting in chapter 11, it's not really specified why they're complaining, but either way it angers God. Now, God responds in a questionable way here, and when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, and the Lord heard it, and his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burnt among them, and consumed them that were in the uttermost parts of the camp. So here's my question. When it talks about the people of Israel complaining, are literally all of them complaining? Like every last one of them? Even Joshua and Caleb who come in later? If it's literally everyone, then okay, fine. The fire thing is a bit overboard in my opinion, but randomly taking out some people based on who's in the uttermost parts of the camp is, I guess, somewhat fair in choosing who gets the punishment. But if, let's say, only 80% of the people were complaining, what if some of those 20% who weren't complaining were in the uttermost parts of the camp? Are they getting burnt up innocently just because of their location? This is a question I come across a lot during each of these Israel complains, God punishes moments. Because as we'll see, God's punishment is often like a random shotgun blast amongst the people, getting them randomly. Granted, if the book says a certain group is doing something, God will only punish that group. But the term, the people, in this and other cases, seems very broad, and I'd like to believe that God is more considerate in who gets punished. And again, this is putting aside the fact that I think burning people is a bit of an overreaction to people complaining. But there is a lot of complaining, and even Moses is tired of it. I mean, they literally start complaining again a couple lines down about not being able to eat meat. And I know I'm a bit critical sometimes of God's justice, but here I think he's actually spot on. He gives the people so much meat that they get tired of it. I think that's much more of a fitting punishment than burning them personally. Anyway, Moses goes to God about this meat thing and, well, I don't want to say he complains because that'd be kind of hypocritical, but he expresses his stress at dealing with all these complaints. And Moses said unto the Lord, Wherefore hast thou inflicted thy servant, and wherefore have I not found favor in thy sight, that thou layest the burden of all this people upon me? He even asks God to just straight up kill him, because he can't deal with this. God responds not by killing him, but by taking the spirit of burden upon Moses and spreading it out amongst 70 elders. Now, does this work and help Moses de-stress? Kinda. There is a moment where he slips up in the future that is probably stress-related. You know who else is complaining? Aaron and his wife. You remember Aaron, Moses' right-hand man, essentially. He also has found favor before God. Well, Aaron and his wife start complaining about Moses because he married an Ethiopian woman. But God hears all this and punishes them by making Aaron's wife leprous. Now, this is another example where the punishment doesn't really feel like it fits the crime. Granted, she eventually heals after being exiled from the camp for 7 days. But not only does infecting someone for complaining not sound good, but also, why is only the wife affected? What about Aaron? Maybe it's because of the work he did earlier on in the story and the fact that he's found favor with God. Still, this is another example where, to my imperfect human mind, the justice doled out doesn't seem like justice. It seems overly harsh. Even Moses, who is the one getting insulted, begs God to heal her, so at least someone else sees the injustice in this. Again, from a human perspective. Alright, so the group reaches nearby the promised land, the land of Canaan, and God asks Moses to send out spies to survey the place. Similar to the counting of men able to go to war, this doesn't seem to serve a tactical goal, as God can literally do anything regardless of whatever intel the spies acquire. But as we'll see, this plan is probably just a big test for the children of Israel. You see, the spies go in and see how intimidating the Canaanites are, and they return to tell the Israelites that they're screwed. There's no way they could beat these guys. There are, however, 2 spies, Caleb and Joshua, who try to convince the people that it's a good land, and God will protect them. But the people seem to side with the other spies. In fact, they even stoned Caleb and Joshua. God is obviously mad because the Israelites don't trust him to protect them and give them the land. And I get it. I mean, God was able to defeat the Egyptians easily already. So it's like, guys, do you really not believe that God's got your back here? And the Lord said unto Moses, How long will this people provoke me? And how long will it be ere they believe me? For all the signs which I have shewed among them. Now, although I agree with God in this context, there are 2 points I want to make from this. One, is fear really a matter of choice? I guess expressing your fear by expressing disbelief in God is a choice, but fear is often irrational, regardless of signs that come before. Like, I have no evidence that a creepy bug is going to crawl into my bed, and it's been empirically shown in the past that this isn't the case. And yet sometimes I get that irrational fear that I'll open my eyes and see Hopper from A Bug's Life on me. Oh, maybe that's why. Secondly, again, God here is saying that they should believe, especially after all the signs that he's shown them. But we here who've lived roughly 2,000 years after Christ have no more signs. Is our ability to believe harder than it was for the Israelites because we have no signs to see with our own eyes? And will God cut us some slack because of this? So because of this fear that the people of Israel expressed, God tells Moses that because they didn't believe in him, he will not let this generation see the promised land, with the exception of Caleb and Joshua. And God kills all those spies that went and gave the report, except for Caleb and Joshua, obviously. To my human mind, again, the punishment kind of outweighs the crime. I mean, they're scared, and yes, they said that they shouldn't try to take the land because they don't think they can win. And that implies that they don't think God has the ability to let them win. But I don't know if that fully warrants death for those spies. And this report the spies bring is called the evil report. But to me at least, evil might imply some sort of malicious intent. But I don't really see that here. I just see a bunch of easily forgetful-minded babies. I don't know if that warrants death. So instead of going to the promised land, the Israelites start wandering around, seemingly without an end destination. Now at one point, a guy is gathering sticks on the Sabbath. He's doing work on a day that's supposed to be for rest, and God says to put him to death. Again, we get the obvious human impression that this doesn't seem like fair justice. The punishment doesn't match the crime. More specifically to this issue though, in the New Testament, we get this quote from Jesus. And he said unto them, The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Well then how do you square this quote with this situation then? It seems pretty contradictory, in the sense that this scenario seems more like a man was made for the Sabbath type deal. Perhaps Jesus is clarifying a stance on the Sabbath for future practice, but his teaching is not retroactive in this sense. Getting back to it, there's this guy Korah, and he's jealous of Moses. So he and his squad start calling him out, and God opens up the earth and it swallows up the Korah squad. And if you want to learn more, you should watch the Legend of Korah TV show. It's all about this moment. Again, obligatory, I don't know if the punishment fits the crime, but there's something we should mention about the Israelites at this point. They are constantly complaining, but not just whining about stuff. They often complain about the fact that God brought them out of Egypt, and they will talk about how they wish they could go back. Imagine you rescue someone from a kidnapping. You bust into the house and free someone chained up in a basement. And on the journey back home or whatever, they're constantly complaining about how much better their life was in the basement than with you, and they wish that they could go back to the basement. Wouldn't that absolutely make you mad? So from a human perspective, even though I don't condone the overuse of death as a punishment throughout this book, I also can see the frustration of God. Again, that frustration in my mind doesn't justify the killings, and the argument could be made that he's God. He shouldn't even have these emotions or something. But if someone was constantly complaining after I did something life-changingly good for them, I'd feel a certain way. Just saying. And it's constant. It's like, oh, I miss Egypt. Why'd you even bother getting us out of Egypt? I want to go back to Egypt. Egypt. Blah, blah, blah. But okay, so at this point in the story, this generation of Israelites won't enter the promised land, except for Moses, Aaron, Caleb, and Joshua. But then Moses and Aaron mess up, which makes them lose out as well. You see, there's no water, so the people are restless, and that's actually a fair thing to complain about. Since you're constantly moving around, you need water. So Moses and Aaron go to God, and he tells Moses to get his staff and speak to the rock in front of them, and water will then flow out of that rock. So Moses and Aaron gather everyone up and say this, Hear now, ye rebels, must we fetch you water out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand, and with his rod he smote the rock twice, and the water came out abundantly. Now when I first read this, I didn't really see what Moses did wrong. Sure, he seems a bit frustrated, and he hits the rock, which God doesn't really tell him to do, but there doesn't seem to be a big infraction. And yet God gets angry with Moses and Aaron, because they didn't believe him and didn't sanctify him when he did this act. So I reread exactly what was said and realized, okay, When Moses is saying, "Must we fetch you water?" he's not talking about him and God. He's talking about him and Aaron maybe, which leaves God out of the picture. Because initially when I read it, I thought he was talking about him and God. But I'm having trouble seeing how this act implies disbelief. I mean, you don't expect water to gush out of a rock even after hitting it with a staff, right? So if anything, it seems like belief in God's power is implied here when Moses hits the stone, because it seems like Moses believes God will make water come out of it. I guess maybe I'm having trouble believing that Moses, this super faithful servant until now, goes to the rock and hits it believing that he and Aaron alone without God have the power to bring water out of the rock. Is that what's being implied here by God's anger? Or am I misinterpreting this passage? Also, Aaron wasn't the one who said it. Why is he catching strays? I guess it doesn't really matter much anyways because Aaron dies shortly after. God tells him that his time of death is upon him. And maybe I'm reading my own feelings into it too much, but it doesn't seem like a punishment kind of death, but rather a natural one. Like God doesn't say put Aaron to death or anything like that. Then we get a weird story. The Israelites are yet again complaining and are mad at God for saving them from slavery in Egypt. So God sends some serpents out among the people, and they bite a lot of them, and many die. The people ask Moses to intercede on their behalf, and God tells Moses to make a brass serpent statue thing. Put it on a pole, and if someone looks at that bronze serpent, they'll be saved after being bitten. This happens, and yes, people are healed. Now this strange little story obviously calls into mind the story of the golden calf and idol worship. So why here is God seemingly putting some false idol in front of the Israelites to heal them? What's the message of this story? Well, thankfully the next verse explains everything. And the children of Israel set forward and pitched it. Wait, what? We're not going to explain what just happened here? What are the Israelites supposed to make of this? What are we supposed to make of this whole story? Well, since we're not really given any direction, I'm going to make my own wild guess. I think God both wanted to heal but also instill guilt in the Israelites, thus satisfying his loving nature, but also his nature for justice. God makes the means for them to be healed, a means also to feel guilt, meaning God wanted the Israelites to look upon the bronze serpent to be healed, but also to be reminded of their transgressions against God earlier. Perhaps this would heal them in the flesh, but also in the spirit through the process of guilt. It's a two birds, one stone scenario, I think. But that's just my guess. After that, the Israelites are just wandering around. They end up in a place called Beer, but God gives them water there. Thought that was pretty funny. Then they want to cross into the land of the Amorites, and they send a message to their king requesting passage. But instead of just a simple no, the Amorites just attack Israel. But God's with them, so Israel obviously wins, and takes over all the Amorite cities. So in this example at least, the Israelites were attacked first and then retaliated. Later on though, it seems that they moved towards the land of Bashan and fight with them. So in that case, they seem more like the aggressors. It's even clearly said that they leave no survivors. So yes, that implies women and children are killed too, because of the war that the Israelites started. So Israel has the Amorites and the Bashanites under their belt, and they're pretty close to the land of Moab. So naturally, the Moabite king, Balak, starts freaking out. What transpires is kind of a comedy where Balak tries to hire this guy, Balaam, this kind of mystic guy, to curse the people of Israel. But God communicates with Balaam and instructs him not only to not curse Israel, but to bless them. And Balaam does this, which obviously pisses off Balak. Despite this, Balak continuously tries again and again to get Balaam to curse them, despite Balaam clearly telling him that he won't. And so Israel just gets blessed over and over again. It's Shakespearean in a way. Like, dude, take the hint already. Still, you gotta feel bad for this desperate guy, seeing all these nations being sacked by the Israelites, and knowing he's next up on the chopping block. I think it's interesting that God is conversing with Balaam the mystic, who I think is a Gentile, right? Like, what's going on here? And if he's gotten himself a reputation for being able to curse and bless people, are these real powers, God-given powers, or just deception like some sort of ancient David Copperfield type? How do you get this reputation, and did God have any hand in it? Now, the Israelites are in this place called Shittim. No, not shitting, Shittim, grow up. And the men are engaging in quote-unquote whoredom with the daughters of Moab there. And this causes them to worship the Moabite god of Baal of Peor. That must be awkward pillow talk. You finish having sex with some girl, and next thing you know, they ask you to come make sacrifices to their goat god. And what do you think God's response to this is, huh? Oh, you guys are worshiping some weird-looking goat thing? Oh, that's cool, that's cool. No, whatever you think God's real response would be in this situation, that's exactly it. And around 24,000 people die. Dang, what Moabite does to him, huh? I'm gonna cut that out. What follows is another census, cause a lot of BS has happened since that first census, and then randomly in chapter 27 there's some teachings about inheritance, as in who gets what after someone dies inheritance. Essentially God says, if a man die and have no son, then ye shall cause his inheritance to pass unto his daughter. If I have any Jewish subscribers out there, let me know if this is still common practice, or if there's more freedom in the whole estate planning process. Now what's pretty interesting is that after all this, God tells Moses to appoint Joshua in his place. One of the 2 spies that believed God would give them the land. So Joshua will be taken over shortly. But what about Caleb, the other spy? Whenever those 2 came up, it was always Caleb and Joshua, like Simon and Garfunkel. One was always listed first. So I wonder what made God choose Joshua over Caleb here. After this, there's more warfare with the Israelites attacking the Midianites, and unlike last time where they left no survivors, they only kill the males and take the women and children hostage. But really that's not much better. Because some Midianite women were involved in seducing the Israelite men to worship their gods, Moses orders any Midianite women who slept with a dude to be killed. But bizarrely, he also orders the death of all the male children as well. What did they do? Maybe Moses is worried they'd grow up and try to avenge the murder of their family, but number 1, who got their family murdered in the first place? And number 2, that's still an assumption. So yeah, if we're keeping it real, again, from our human intuitive moral perspective, this whole war campaign and the Israelites are not looking good here, Moses included. Like, this campaign is one of the big objections leveled at the Judeo-Christian God, and it's a worthy one to deal with as you're reading through all this stuff. Yes, you could argue that these other nations were morally bad, but the killing is indiscriminate. Like, kill all the boys in this case and leave no survivors in our last case. Are they all morally bad? The boys haven't even gotten the chance to grow up yet and make serious moral decisions. We were all pretty stupid when we were young. We shouldn't be judged forever for that. In the comments, feel free if you can to muster up the best moral defense you can for this war campaign that the Israelites are going on. At the end of the book, the Israelites are camped out near the Jordan River, right next to the Promised Land. God talks to Moses about what he expects when the Israelites enter the Promised Land with Joshua. And oddly, there's this emphasis on refuge cities, cities where someone who's killed another person can take refuge in and be safe from someone trying to avenge the dead. So we jump from this no mercy, kill the other tribes indiscriminately, to this high mercy, set up refuge cities for murderers situation. It's very strange, and it's not like God is saying that they're allowed to get away with it. There needs to be laws and trials and whatnot. But it's like, where was the due process when it came to killing all the Midianite boys? So we end on that kind of sour note, honestly. And when Joshua takes over and the real campaign begins, we're obviously going to get a lot more killings. Let me just say that, as a Christian, I think it's right to question and feel concern about the death of innocents. Obviously no one is perfect, so we get into the whole discussion of what is innocence, but also, it's hard to believe that anything a Midianite boy did would warrant their death. It seems to me that a Christian, going off Jesus' teachings, would not want civilians to be murdered. People not engaged in warfare who are not actively trying to kill you. That to me makes sense. But then how do we square it with these Old Testament military campaigns? Again, if you got a good answer, then I'd love to hear it in the comments. A lot of responses I hear tend to just say that, well, the other tribes are bad and did evil things. And yes, that's true. But maybe I'm just being too individualist here. Was everyone in there evil? Was every individual's evil so bad that it warranted their death? Even the children? Like those members of those tribes that engaged in child sacrifice to their gods? Yeah, fuck them. I don't care if they get killed. But what about the kids themselves? The non-sacrifice kids, I guess, who grow up to be 11 or whatever. Why should they die as well? Give me your answers to this tough moral question in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this episode of Skeptic Reads the Bible, be sure to like, subscribe, hit the bell, and share the video if you're a super fan. And with that, I wish you all a beautiful rest of your day.